Chapter 31 King of the Pathfinders. With the fire blazing cheerily again, I crawled in under the tent fly. I was just going to ask you about Christy Palmerston when that wretched owl burst his bagpipes, I said. You don't appreciate the love call of the killer owl. He smiled. Oh well, Christy Palmerston was the king of the Pathfinders, though some very good men gave a hand in opening up this country. Christy first appeared in these parts with Mulligan on one of his exploring trips. It was Mulligan who reported payable gold on the Palmer, you know, the sort of river you dream of finding, a real river of gold. I've never been across on the Cooktown side, so of Christie's adventures there in those hectic years I can't speak of at first hand. Wild and woolly by all accounts, he seems to have been a real Bully Hayes of the bush across on that side. No doubt all manner of startling things could and did happen in a wild land where they actually dug up 54 tons of gold within 3 years. Christy suddenly appeared on this side as a quiet stranger with a savage black boy called Pompo, who thought the world of him. No one knew or cared about his first coming. Along the coast then were but a few small camps, called settlements, scattered groups of pioneers battling for dear life to make a go of things when Mulligan found the Hodgkinson. However, from the coast, Christy plunged into the jungle and cut a track that opened up the Russell River goldfield. It was a jungle hell, but there was gold there, bringing desperately needed encouragement to the early coastal settlers. For 15 years, Christy was a pathfinder throughout this area. His tracks opened up the way to the Mulgrave Beatrice. Tully, Russell, Barron, and Johnstone rivers, and then the country beyond. Big areas, these of forests and scrubs. His tracks opened up mineral timber and sugar lands, and at last he found a track from Innisfail right up the escarpment to the great tableland. Thus, at that point of the range, the way was opened right down to moorland and the sea. Another great pathfinder was Oswald, who found a track from Milla to Innisfail, and thus the sea at moorland. Surely you have heard of Oswald's track, or Fred Warner's track, of Douglas, of Smith, of Jim Robson, opening up the Pack track to Herberton, of Atherton's track, of Jim Sturdy and Charlie Davis, of Doyle's track all the way from Herberton to Georgetown. Imagine a man finding and marking a track over those difficulties and distance in those times. These and other men were the pathfinders. When Jack and Newell found 10 away back in the ranges at Herberton, it was Christy who found a track, and a wheel track, to connect up with the wagon track from the Hodgkinson to Port Douglas. It was he who suggested the possibility of a railway track up along the Barren Gorge. The railway, of course, made Cairns, and the hinterland too. You won't recognize the port of Cairns in another 30 years. prophetic words I did not, let alone the lovely city of Cairns of today. Christie was a silent man, he resumed. He would vanish into the jungles to reappear most unexpectedly, and rarely spoke of his adventures. They were told by his native followers, and by those lonely settlers and prospectors he had rescued or befriended, for he had the uncanny knack of turning up just at the right time, when a settler was besieged in his hut, a timber hunter crippled under a fallen log, a prospector dying alone of fever. It's surprising the number of isolated people he rescued thus, mostly at the last moment. The only explanation the settlers could think of was that he must have received news from the blacks, who feared him, sometimes tried to ambush him, yet who held him in some strange regard. He would shoot a black fellow on the instant at the first sign of hostility. He was quite ruthless, he had to be, yet he would save a black fellow in danger regardless of risk to himself, just as he would a white man, and he was often a rough doctor to their women and pickaninnies, which may in part help explain their queer regard for him. There was nothing frightening in his appearance either, maybe a bit calculating, determined looking, but he had savage eyes. Some of his wild bodyguard told odd stories of those eyes. He filled his pipe. He had been talking steadily. Perhaps in time, he resumed, the track Christie will be best known by is the Palmerston Track. It lies south of us, running from Moreland Harbor to Innisfail, then right on to Cedar Creek, and across over these ranges to Herberton. You can form a vague guess as to what he went through to find and cut a track over all those difficulties of primitive range and jungle, where most men would become hopelessly lost before they had gone a mile. This particular track of Palmerston's has been, is being, and increasingly will be in the future, the means of opening up new, big areas of sugar, timber, agricultural, and mineral lands. He paused. His voice had almost seemed to sadden. It flashed upon me that though he obviously admired Palmerston so, he feared the change the Pathfinder's work must bring about. Wild bushlands steadily going under cultivation, sawmills, the vanishing of these magnificent timbers, and wild life, clear mountain streams muddied and silted by debris from mining camps, where, as I looked upon Mulligan, Atherton, Palmerston, Oswald, Moffat, Jack, Newell, Doyle, and Maslin, and the other Pathfinders, like them with admiration for the townships and many homes their life work had and was increasingly providing in these wilds, how I longed to find a mineral field, and thus be the means of opening up country to support the homes of men and women. Yet here before me was the very man who could do it, who I felt would love to do so, yet his very love of these lands in their primitive state forbade him. In the chill of a now deathly jungle silence, I gradually became aware of the singing creek. Was it imagination that brought a note of sadness to its song as a quiet voice spoke? Yes, I suppose work and towns must come, but all this life and beauty throughout which we have walked all this day, and will tomorrow, and for days afterwards, for weeks, nay months, if we wished, will vanish forever. Feeling decidedly chilly now, I muttered, I'll stoke up the fire and crawled out to throw on more wood, thinking as the flames hummed up, "This man can read my thoughts like a book. What on earth can I do about it?" "Well," he resumed abruptly as I crawled back in under the tent fly, "Christie used to plunge into the jungles with Black Boy Pompo, a blanket, a rifle, and cane knife. He lived on the country, he had to. Easy enough in the big scrubs, to the man who knows how. Except in the wet season. Rain falls in feet and yards here during a heavy wet, not in ridiculous inches, and during the wet most game seem to hole up. Even edible vegetable life seems to vanish. With every creek a raging torrent, you can faintly guess what life would be like in these big scrubs. However, Christie could survive even a wet season away from the civilization of the day, though he would never tell how he did it. He lost a priceless friend, though, when Pompo died. Thereafter he took with him on his trips several Chinese and 6 black boys. He picked them for intelligence and endurance, and from different and antagonistic tribes, so that they would be unlikely to conspire against him. He trained them how to handle a rifle. They proved to be an efficient, savage bodyguard. I cannot see how, in that life he led, he could possibly have survived without them. For the wild aboriginal is not a fool, believe me, and they had realized that the work of such men as Mulligan and Jack and Newell and Palmerston was opening up their beloved tribal grounds to increasing rushes of white men, with their diseases, which must surely mean extinction to them. At the same time, Christie had some queer affinity with the wild aboriginals. He was a wild man himself, anyway, and he held some control over them, for which they both dreaded and admired him. So the scrub aboriginals have told me anyway. I have often wondered, too, whether it was through music he held some further control over them, for both he and they loved music. "Music!" I exclaimed. "Yes," he answered, and looked at me queerly. "Yes, music, even here in the depths of the jungle. I notice you have been listening to the music of the creek." I just stared. He smiled and knocked out his pipe against a root. "There is music in the scrubs and the forest," he said softly, "anywhere at any time, and the voices are different in the night and the day and the seasons. You can hear the trees singing, if you have the ears to hear, and the something inside which translates into music. There are countless voices in the bush, especially in these wonderful areas. As for the aboriginals, you may think their idea of music is of the crudest. It is not so. If in the right environment the rhythm can register in your blood, bringing vaguely the meaning too. Their life, their legends, their beliefs are bound up in their dances and songs, chants you would call them. Well, Christie's blood reacted to the mystic meanings within those age-old chants. He was one with them when he sang with them, for all were wild men of the woods. You see, there is a lot more in life than we dream of. He gazed out at the fire a moment. I thought I caught a murmurous rustle of the palm fronds overhanging the creek merging with the hum of the flames. Many nights alone in places such as this had developed his wonderful hearing, taught him the music of the bush voices. It takes years, he said, and gazed at me, and you must never let up, but it comes to you. You have read my thoughts again, I said uneasily, and clearer than I had thought them out. He half smiled, with a trace of pleasure. That also comes to you, he said. However, in this environment, under these conditions, it is easy. Well, Christy Palmerston foresaw that in the opening up of these lands, with increasing population, the wild lands must go, and he was a man of the wilds, so he sailed for Malaya, where the big jungles are. He accepted exploratory work from some Malayan sultan. He died a few years back of fever, alone in the jungle as usual, and there his bones lie tonight. Perhaps his spirit roams the jungles, I said in quiet surprise at the words. He glanced at me sharply, a strange expression in his eyes. There is no such thing as death, he said slowly, as you'll realize whether you live long enough or not. And now suppose we turn in. We've got tough traveling ahead tomorrow. What if I put the billy on? I suggested eagerly. A bright idea, he answered in a pleased way. Watch out you don't tumble into the creek. It'll be cold down there. Timely warning, pressing through the blackness of undergrowth down to icy cold water, taught me that even to fill the billy in the big scrubs can be an awkward job. Warily I hurried back to keep this man talking while possible. In no time that fierce fire had the billy singing, and we were under the tent fly again, sipping steaming hot tea. It tastes good, he declared, and carefully laying down his half-emptied pannikin, felt for his pipe. Maybe you would not have been quite so keen to grope your way down to the creek if you'd known there was a python out there. His half-smile looked grim to me. In this chilly silence I heard myself saying, "A python. Yes, a scrub python, a big fellow. He's slithering about his business out there in the dark nearby." "How do you know?" "I can smell him." When I did not reply, he said, "You doubt me again. I told you I can smell snakes." "Oh yes," I remembered. "Well, this is a perfect night for the scent of wild things to linger." He was quite close too. He had stopped to peer at the firelight when you went out for water, but he is crawling past on business bent now. Are you going to shoot him? Of course not. He is doing me no harm. He has just as much right to live as I have. He lit up the match, illuminated his expressionless face until a whiff of tobacco smoke clouded it. "I thought that pythons and snakes and things like to keep in out of the wet and damp," I said doubtfully. "Of course they do, but it's regulated by season and environment. The scrub reptiles naturally have to be immune to dampness. There is plenty of that in the scrubs. However, the big fellow out there must be on urgent business, for he is taking a risk in crawling over this sodden depth of rotted leaf mold on a humid night. He would feel more comfortable and happy coiled around the branch of a tree overlooking a wallaby pad." I leant over and refilled his pannikin, asking, "But why is he taking a risk? Fungus, what?" A phosphorescent fungus growth. I gaped at him. He smiled, sipping at his pannikin. This tea was quite a bright idea of yours, he said. Have you ever thought that tea, such a solace to the human race, is grown by a plant? Have you ever thought of what plant life means to all of us? That is a fact that without plant life the human race would become extinct. I glanced outside. To my boyish imagination, the firelit trees seeming listening in a brooding silence. I answered dubiously, "No, it is a plain fact. Without grass, nothing as we know it could exist, not even fish." This was getting too deep for me. "Tell me about this fungus and the python." He half smiled. "Yes," he murmured, "better these silent trees that so often are not silent. Then the whine of the circular saw. Oh well, you will see plenty of fungi, of numerous sorts, before our little walkabout is over. You have not seen then in the jungle at night an itchy, very unhappy python crawling along as if he were on fire?" "No," I replied unbelievingly. He half smiled. "Well, I have on a night dark as this." I followed him quite a way. Believe me, he was on fire all right, though not exactly as we understand fire. He was luminously covered by a phosphorescent glow. Much was already growing alive upon him, but from the moist leaves he was picking up more as urgently he crawled along, much more. By some natural attraction, I really believe. It was a remarkable sight, fascinating too, to follow along beside him and watch that ghostly film glowing and fading and glowing again as his writhing coils picked up more and more. His big body was fairly quivering as he urged himself across that bad patch with all speed possible. He could have crossed that bad ground much quicker too, but he panicked. Twice he reached the very edge of that sodden ground, only to writhe himself right back into it again. I suppose the fungus he had earlier picked up was beginning to eat into him now, in between the scales probably, maybe something like tiny fiery insects biting in under your toenails to the quick. I suppose you've seen a worm or a caterpillar being attacked by ants when crossing a roadway. Yes, well, just as more and still more ants attack the caterpillar, so it writhes and turns and loses all sense of direction, until finally it's overwhelmed. Well, that is what seemed to be happening to the python, and he grew frantic. When he did break across into clearer country, he was in a bad way, believe me. I stood there in the dark and watched him travel to safety, and he was covering the ground with all the last speed he could now muster, leaving a trail of fading phosphorescence until he vanished. Of course, as he writhed over this clearer, firmer ground, he was scraping his coils upon the earth, and thus scraping off a lot of the loosely clinging stuff from his belly. He drank the last of his tea. Slowly he filled the pipe again, while I sat silently, still disbelieving, far too inexperienced as yet to know that what he said was truth. "So far as reptiles are concerned," he resumed, "they are subject at times to a parasitic fungus disease, according to seasonal varies and environment and luck. For like humans, many escape while others are unlucky. The fungus growth or spores or whatever it may be attaches itself to the underpart of the snake, its belly scales, as it passes over the moist leaves and spreads and grows. It is mostly along the sodden creek banks and those quagmires of springs that you'll sometimes find even upon a mountain top, that these fungus things are dangerously thick, just as you found the leeches that made a bloody mess of your legs this afternoon. I suppose the fungus breeds or grows everywhere throughout the scrubs during a heavy wet, when the wrigglers lie up in their hideouts, of course. That fungus must kill a lot of snakes. Oh, I don't know. No one has investigated it. Probably it may do so when a cycle season comes around, when it is very bad, but of course instinct teaches them to avoid the dangerous places. And then when they do get caught, the victim tries to work out his own remedy. Every living thing will put up a fight for life, you know. Plants fight for their lives too. I've seen a snake in this particular case, a scrub python also, working with might and main and no little common sense in cleaning himself of the fungus. He'd coiled himself tightly round and round the limb of a rough-barked tree and was slowly and heavily dragging himself round it, actually scraping the fungus from his scales. Then he writhed himself round the trunk of the tree and dragged himself to a higher branch, and there went through the same process. As he began knocking out his pipe, I asked, "Why?" "So that he'd have a clean limb to scrape off the remainder of the fungus, of course. If he kept to the same limb, he'd only begin to dirty himself again with the fungus he's already rubbed off." You don't believe me again." He smiled good-humoredly. "I wonder what you'd say, or rather think, if I told you of some of the real deep secrets vividly alive here in this vast womb of life called the scrubs. Never mind, now look here. You did not believe me when I told you about the dancing worms. Would you believe that in this scrub there are worms that grow as long as a man?" He grinned at my disbelief. "I'll show you plenty tomorrow," he said quite amiably. "Well, we'll be walking over a lot of creekhead country. These worms really only average 3 feet long, but I'll find you quite a few at 5 feet, and I've really seen them grow to over 6 feet, as round as a broomstick. For good measure, I'll show them to you in their gaudy uniforms. One fellow in deep blue, another in pale. His cousin is red, his uncle is deep purple, his nephew's in green, and if you like to sit up tomorrow night upon some chilly creek bank, I'll guarantee you see them in their night attire, a dull glow of color phosphorus, as they crawl in their 5-foot lengths along the creek bank. And now we'd better turn in." Lying there in the fire-lit coolness, slow water drips sighing down on the tent fly, the black breath of the jungle all around. For some time I could not sleep. It was the too sudden opening of a new world to a lad. The jungle, that awful scrub owl, dancing worms, worms 5 feet long, phosphorescent pythons, this hidden creek which sang a lovely lullaby of haunting voices. How much of all of it was true, what far greater truths might be lay hidden here. Thoughts wandered away with the lulling rhythm of the creek waters singing by. What was that about some boatman's song? No boatman here. except a trapped insect on a fallen leaf, being fast carried away, abandoned hope he would be dashed to pieces over the falls. It was a 3,000-foot drop between here and the distant sea. Yes, the creek was singing its traveling song, the leaf floating away ever a little faster. Into whispering night, the creek was changing note. The leaf and I were floating along, floating. Chapter 32, The Ogre. Next midday we boiled the billy in a glade of the fairies, a dell of wondrous beauty. "A carpet of moss," I exclaimed, "green as an emerald. No sultan's palace could be as beautiful as this." I should say not. He was gazing at tendrils of orchids drooping from statuesque palms, like delicate pink bells with tongues of gold, the first orchids I'd seen in the scrub. This most unusual space was nearly as large as a ballroom, draped all around by curtains of flowering creepers hanging from branches. There was a delicate green light throughout this glade, and the smoke of our fire coiled slowly up in a pale blue spiral to merge in greenery amongst the leafy canopy above. With a Johnny cake in one hand and a cold boiled pigeon in the other, I said, grinning, "How strangely that smoke coils! If we were in the Arabian Nights, I could easily imagine some long, skinny old genie taking shape in it." "Yes," he answered dreamily, through a mouthful of Johnny cake. I went on, "If we stayed perfectly quiet, fairies might come gliding out from those ferny bowers and dance upon the moss." "Why not?" he replied, swallowing the Johnny cake. I gazed at him a moment. "You're joking. Surely you don't believe in fairies, and little men in green." "Maybe not, though many folk throughout the world do, and you did not believe in some strange things I've already shown you. Remember, however, there is an ogre in this dell." He was gazing straight across at a mighty spider web spun from branch to branch and right down to the mossy carpet. "What on earth do you mean? Come, and I'll show you." And he stood up and strolled across to the web, a silvered masterpiece that the world's most artistic jeweler could never have imitated. "What a mighty web," I said, "and what a hideous thing he is. She, as you'll know if we have a little luck." "What do you mean?" "The spider in the web center is a lady spider, and this is the season and perfect day when she is liable to expect a visitor." "But how do you know?" "Oh," he answered somewhat shortly, "I've been traveling through and through these scrubs for quite a time now." His eyes seemed searching the grass around. "But what an awful-looking thing," I said in disgust. "Yes," he said absently, "but don't touch the web or she might spring on the instant. Otherwise she can't see you, she's near blind." "How on earth do you know?" "Because I've tested them, of course." He was staring down at his feet, staring all around. "What are you searching for?" "Her visitor." "What sort of visitor?" "Her boyfriend, of course." "But he won't be able to see her," I said stupidly. "Of course he will. He can see. He is the one who must see." "But how about boiling the billy again?" "May as well put on those turkey eggs while you're at it. I'm feeling extra peckish. Sing out when they're boiled. I'll watch here." I walked away, not much interested. To think that that awful-looking, huge, hunched-up, blacky brownish, hairy-looking thing should have a boyfriend visitor. Ugh, it just left me cold. Yet again I wondered at my strange friend. When the billy was boiled, he took his 2 eggs and pannikin and johnny cake and sat down by the foot of that web. With cheerful appetite, I set to where I was, those eggs and that billy. Tea tasted great. Certainly we were living surprisingly well. Even old Mick and Jim away back at Nigger Creek, wherever that was now, would not be dining on cold turkey and fresh boiled turkey eggs. I was drinking the last of the tea when he whistled and beckoned, pointing with a twig at the roots below the web. There he is. Just squat quietly on your haunches, not too close. He's too agitated and too anxious to notice us. What is he anxious about? You'll see presently, he replied grimly. Are you sure this is the one? He's not a third her size, not nearly as ugly either. Just watch and see. I stared down on that spider boy, who certainly did seem agitated, standing now on little hind legs, timidly reaching up at the web whose strands towered so mightily before him. Delicately he touched a strand. Away up she seemed to freeze, and he leapt back a full 6 inches, crouching ready to flee. I peered closely down, quite interested now. A soft chuckle came from the man beside me. The timid visitor crept forward, reached up, and his tiny outstretched leg touched the strand again, only to leap back. The third time he hung on. She, away up there in the center, seemed quiescent, a hunched bundle of ugliness, standing up on his short hind legs now. Most cautiously he shook that strand. He is vibrating it, whispered the man beside me, in a certain way. He's really sending her a love telegram. She can't see him, but he is vibrating that strand, telling her she's the loveliest thing he's ever seen. And would she mind if he climbs up to kiss her good day? That'll be the day, I grinned. Yes, he murmured, the one and only day. Gingerly, very gingerly, the little spider began climbing that strand, clinging to it while vibrating it now and then, only to pause, fearfully watching up. Even I could tell now that he was ready to drop instantly to the ground and run for his life. She can drop down on him fast as lightning if she's annoyed, murmured my mate. Why should she? I asked. The course of true love seldom runs smoothly, he chuckled. In the jungles as elsewhere. Just watch how young Lochinvar climbs up to his lady's boudoir. Lochinvar climbed most hesitantly. I could never have imagined such an uneasy lover, but she merely waited, all hunched up, glaring down upon the intruder. Looking up, I could now detect her eyes gleaming like pinpoints of luminous green. Is she really blind? I whispered. Not quite. She can focus on him now, and he's not too happy about it either. Slowly, indeed, now Lochinvar climbed, or rather crawled, up until he was within 3 inches of her. He hung delicately there quite a time, then with the greatest care began to edge across the web right around behind her. Did you ever see such a frightened lover? Chuckled my mate. But what on earth has he got to be scared of? Wouldn't you be? You've got a queer sense of humor. Lochinvar was right behind her now. Most delicately he crept down to her, reaching out a gentle foreleg, stroked her, snatched back his little arm. She had not moved. He tried again, with quick movement, sidled up beside her. My mate stood up. "It's all right now," he said. "He's clicked. They're only interested in one another, and I can assure you he won't know another thing, but for one awful second." Standing thus, we had the center of the web before our eyes. They were motionless for quite a while. Then, with delicately terrified caution, he began stretching out a hind leg behind him, as if groping for a strand. His foot, or claw, or whatever it was, touched a strand, slowly fastened to it. "Watch," hissed my mate. "He is getting ready to jump for his life." Another leg crept out, fastened to a strand. Then, as the spider leapt free, a flurry of outspread claws wheeled round and fastened all over him. The web rocked violently. He was overwhelmed under a fat, hairy body that was with fierce energy spinning a web round him. "She is lashing him to the web," said my mate's voice calmly, as securely as a dozen men could lash a terrified prisoner to a post. "But what for? You'll see soon." The big web grew still as she crouched back. She seemed to be quietly licking hairy forepaws and what seemed like fangs. I saw that indeed he was lashed, helpless, with unbreakable security to the web. Then she crept forward, gloated over him a moment, snapped at him, began to. "But she's eating him," I protested. "That's so, but why?" "Why not? His job is finished. She'll lay scores and scores of eggs in a few days. There'll be plenty of young spiders. She may as well eat him. After all, she'll have to feed them." "She's a beast of a thing," I said with utter loathing. "Come on." "I've seen enough of your spider lovers." He laughed softly as we slipped on our swags. "Have you never seen the praying mantis?" he asked. "They do the same thing." "No," I replied, "never heard of it." "Well, they do, but we'd better step out. We've wasted too much time studying the love story of a spider. However, other species manage with happier endings, if you feel any consolation." But I only grunted, my eyes glancing up at a white myrtle flower glowing like a star in the gloom. We'd gone quite a way before I realized I'd missed enjoying that beautiful thing. A rifle bird flashed by and was gone in a shimmer of color, and I knew we were near a creek. Birds are plentiful along a creek, for there they have space to fly up and down above the creek, the only place in the big scrubs where you can see a ribbon of blue far above. Of course, there are many birds, a multitude in fact, that feast upon the berries on that sea of tree tops, but they can rarely be seen from below. And yet there are plenty of birds down below too, within the scrub itself. What a lot I had to learn. I learnt a bit right at this very creek. "What if we tried this creek?" I asked grumpily, and with glancing round was sorry I spoke. "Righto," he replied cheerfully, "but let us cross over first." As sure stepping as a cat, we walked over the slippery, moss-grown boulders, while I clumsily followed. As surely, too, he had picked the one place where we could step up onto the bank without having to force our way through undergrowth. A mighty green frog with a waistcoat like a purple lily flopped on the rock between my feet. "He's wondering what strange thing this is that he sees," chuckled the jungle man from the bank. "I've a good mind to boot him in the belly." I glowered down at that squatting giant gaping up. He dashed near, scared me into the water. "Don't hurt the old boy. I suppose he thinks we are some harmless sort of water toad. If we looked like a crane or a snake or a water rat, he'd dive for his life." As I stepped up beside him, he was frowning at the creek, saying, "That fool of a butterfly. Curiosity can teach you things, but it can kill too." A large butterfly, gorgeous wings outspread, hung almost motionless in the air of a man's height above the frog. "Quick, notice old Greenback's haunches and his eyes," he murmured. The frog crouched, his eyes protruding, gleaming. "Will he get him?" "Not in that position. If the butterfly flies higher or darts swiftly away, he will be safe. If not, it will be touch and go, but it will mean a mighty leap, whether or no." For a moment or two I thought the butterfly was going to hover down upon what must have seemed a succulent, strange green leaf to it. Hesitantly, though, it began to flutter away. Almost instantly the frog leapt. He was bounding up in the air with legs outstretched, looking ever so much longer and thinner now. The butterfly made one frantic wing beat. Then one wing was gripped in the frog's mouth, and they were plunging down to splash in the water and vanish. "Oh well," said the jungle man. "A pity the butterfly was not half a second quicker. But that sort of thing is going on every moment of the day and night in these places. We would have thought it much worse if that frog had been a crocodile." "But why?" I asked. "Just think it out. You have the queerest ideas," I said slowly. "Not so that could easily have happened had we incautiously been crossing a coastal jungle stream farther up north. Men have actually been known to step upon a crocodile up there, thinking it was a log, as you'll hear all about it if you persist in your idea of wandering in those places. Well now, here is the pick and dish. Choose your own place and the creek and try it out. I'm going to enjoy a smoke," and he did. Quietly smoked, silently teaching me a lesson while I made an ass of myself. Ignorance is bliss until you find out that you're the goat. Eventually I waded out of the icy water, threw down that baby pick and dish, sat down and glumly pulled on my boots. "Satisfied?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I answered shortly. "Impossible to prospect any creek here without proper tools." "Not impossible," he said. "I'll show you how when we come to some more likely-looking creek." However, we could not add those proper tools to our load. The trip would become a laborious misery, and we would not go far. And now we'd better be moving. The going has changed, and you'll soon find out. We must step out to reach the comfy camp I wish to make tonight." I followed with mixed feelings as he slipped a cane knife from his swag. Not the usual heavy scrub knife, trust him. In years fast coming I was often to be grateful for learning Even about such a knife, it was lightly humming now, just light strokes slashing through cane and vine as he stepped along as if sliding his way through the bad patches, while I clumsily followed, soon scratched and torn, while he effortlessly kept going, though clearing a track. Gone was the soft, clean floor of the scrub between the tree trunks. This was a tangle of vine and creeper, lianas like the hawsers of ships, drooping down from the branches, undergrowth that clung and tripped the tiring legs. And then even he was slowed up in a maze of lawyer cane that gripped the ankles and legs like writhing snakes, the hooks of the comeback quicks ripping through pants and shirt to hook in the ribs and pull a man back, pushing the leaves of the wretched things aside, step by step lifting the legs up, out of the grip of the canes, forced to put them gingerly down amongst the snappy, clinging canes again, was misery. Itching and burning legs and arms became smothered with loathsome, blood-sucking leeches. It slowed him, but I could never have got through had he not waited again and again. "Keep going," he encouraged, "but take it steady, don't exhaust yourself. We cannot work our way round this patch, but we'll be through it before long." Just as well, I breathed. My legs feel like lead already, but they're burning from scratches. I can hardly drag my ankles up through these blasted clinging canes. My arms and ribs and legs are torn to shreds. I feel like biting these comeback quicks each time they hook me back. Much more of this, and a man would flop down and to hell with it all. "A comfy camp you'd enjoy," he said, grinning, "smothered in these leaves, tangled up in the canes like a grasshopper that's kicked its way into a loose ball of prickly string. What if a hungry old wild boar came snuffling along in the night and shoved a tusk into your ribs?" "Oh, carry on," I grumbled. "Lead the way out of this green hell quick as you can." And the knife hummed as it slashed on in earnest now. Great bundles of these canes grew out from the butts of each palm-like plant to coil out among their fellows, only to stretch up a come-back quick, hook itself up onto a tree branch, then go climbing on and up, branch by branch, to disappear in the foliage. Thousands of these canes reaching from the ground into the highest branches, locked tree to tree in a wild confusion of elastic-like ropes, and the strength of little things was presently apparent in an acre-wide tangle of straining scrub, for a big tree had fallen, yet could not fall because thousands of tautened ropes of canes held its dragging weight to the straining tops of its brothers. Among the torn-away branches, up there was even a little blue glimpse of sky. No wonder these canes are the practically unbreakable ropes of the aborigines. Soon, farther north, I was to see them with these canes lashed to trees, hold maddened crocodiles. What men the early pathfinders were to force a way through country like this, let alone find direction. It was not only they had the heart of lions, they must have possessed some sixth sense as well. I was just about done when he cut our way through, but he kept on going. No fear of my falling behind, though I'd have given anything to flop down for a spell. How on earth was he finding his way, sighting from tree to tree? But this seemed ridiculous, for visibility was only a few yards, and yet there was no chance of seeing the sky, and I knew he prided himself on never carrying a compass, not that it would be much use here, yet he seemed to know exactly where he was going. Such bushmanship amazed me, as when he lifted the rifle to fire straight up into that green roof, and down came softly falling a plump body, a beautiful pigeon, green as a leaf, with a purple breast, larger than the domestic pigeon. 5 times more the little rifle cracked. I just could not see a thing for that impenetrable canopy of leaves. "We'll enjoy a tasty supper tonight," he said, as picked up the pigeons. "But come along, we must keep going." And we moved. The scrub was growing ominously dark when he halted and turned around. Hear anything, but only the murmurous breath of a million trees gave answer. Smell anything, but to my questing nostrils came only a faint dampness and the elusive tang of a sea of greenery. "Lie down there in that clear place. There's just about room. Smell about a foot above the loam." When I'd filled my lungs with just about all the moldy leaf matter on earth, his voice came. "Now run your nostrils slowly along that big damp root. About 6 inches above it, inhale slowly but deeply." I did so, and when just about tired of it, glanced up. "What do you smell?" "I'm not sure, but there seems to be a faint tang of smoke." "You're learning, but there's no fire in the scrubs," I said, puzzled though pleased. "You can never be certain what is in the scrubs," he replied, and I jumped erect like a startled hare to a sharp, rhythmic clapping of drumming. Silence a moment, then in perfect unison that sharp clap of drums, muffled by trees, yet strangely reverberating. "Natives," I whispered. He nodded. Again those challenging drums. Silence. "It is their salute to the setting sun," he said. "We'll hear no more. Come on." I followed, bewildered. He was making straight towards where that sound had come. I would have hurried in the opposite direction. Surely there were no real wild natives left in these ranges. But then I vaguely remembered hearing an old-timer by Old Mick's campfire declaring, "There's still a little tribe or two of the wild uns left hidden away out in the big scrubs." Old Mick's camp seemed a desirable place to be right now.